There's a particular kind of conversation that feels like watching someone stack matchsticks in the rain. You admire the effort, but you already know how it ends. That's how it feels whenever someone tries to justify slavery on behalf of a deity who supposedly handcrafted galaxies, moral laws, and the entire human conscience. You'd think a being with cosmic power might also have the foresight to say, very clearly, maybe don't own each other. Apparently that note got lost somewhere between creating supernovas and micromanaging dietary restrictions. And yet people still defend it, not because the defense makes sense, but because the alternative, admitting the sacred text, isn't the perfect moral blueprint they were promised. Feels like letting go of the last rope on a cliffside. It's the same psychological instinct that makes someone insist the relationship is fine because leaving it would require confronting years of denial. Familiar lies often feel safer than unfamiliar truths. The most common excuse, the one held up like a shield made of wet cardboard, is the claim that slavery in ancient religious texts wasn't really slavery. It was something else, something gentler, something humane, something that, by some miracle of cognitive gymnastics, deserves not condemnation, but cultural context. This argument spreads for the same reason all fragile ideas spread, because the people offering it have learned to protect a belief first and reality second. The irony here is rich. If someone today insisted that any modern institution, say a pharmaceutical company, had a gentler form of exploitation in its early years, we'd pull the receipts, call the lawyers, and demand a public apology. But when the entity in question is divine, the standards melt like butter on hot pavement. Suddenly, the definition of slavery becomes negotiable, language becomes elastic, and moral clarity becomes a luxury item people no longer think they can afford. There's something revealing in the desperation of these defenses. It's a confession without words. I can't allow myself to see this as wrong, because if I do, the entire structure I rely on might collapse. Structures built on fear, however, have a habit of collapsing eventually, even if no one touches them. Denying the obvious doesn't strengthen foundations. It just delays renovation. The "it wasn't really slavery" refrain is surprisingly modern. Ancient believers didn't bother with such euphemisms. They knew exactly what they meant, and they meant ownership, lives regulated, bodies controlled, families divided. The modern reinterpretation is less about truth and more about damage control, public relations for an ancient institution that left a lot of skeletons in the basement, sometimes literally. Even more fascinating is watching this excuse evolve in real time. First, the argument claims slavery wasn't harsh. Then, when that fails, it claims it was harsh but divine. When that collapses, it claims humanity wasn't ready for freedom yet, which is another way of saying an all-wise deity couldn't inspire people beyond their environment, but ordinary humans eventually could. That's not spirituality, that's historical outsourcing. But the most bizarre twist is the claim, whispered with the solemn confidence of someone revealing a secret ingredient, that the divine law regulating slavery was actually an early civil rights movement in disguise. As if the cosmic architects surveyed the human condition and thought, you know what will teach compassion? A well-structured manual on how to purchase, breed, discipline, and inherit other people? Quite a plan. This kind of reasoning emerges from a strange mix of reverence and fear. Reverence tells people their scriptures must be moral. Fear tells them they cannot survive believing otherwise. The fusion of the two produces mental acrobatics that would impress Olympic judges. When someone is terrified of seeing cracks in a worldview, they'll sandblast the cracks, repaint the wall, and insist it's stronger than ever, all while ignoring the growing pile of plaster dust at their feet. And that brings us to the psychological core of this whole defense. The slavery excuse isn't really about slavery, it's about identity protection. For many, their beliefs are stitched directly into the fabric of who they think they are. Questioning the belief feels like questioning the self. That's why even obviously flawed ideas get knighted as unassailable truths. The alternative is admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like being unarmed in a world that never promised kindness. Still, no amount of fear, no amount of reinterpretation, and no amount of sentimental attachment can turn ownership into compassion. Words can be massaged, history can be polished, and translations can be softened, but the core remains. The divine message, as preserved in these texts, treats human beings as property, not as children of the cosmos, not as vessels of dignity, property. And yet the argument persists, not because it's solid, but because the emotional cost of letting it go feels unbearable. People defend the indefensible because the alternative threatens the architecture of their psychological sanctuary, and so they take positions that would horrify them in any other context, hoping no one notices the contradictions piling up behind them. But the contradictions are there, glowing like neon signs. They're impossible to unsee once the light hits them, and once those lights turn on, the whole excuse unravels, not in dramatic explosions, but in a quiet, unavoidable realization. The moral compass attributed to the divine was often behind the curve, not ahead of it. And that realization, more than anything, is what the defenders desperately try to avoid. There's a moment in every discussion about divine morality where someone leans back, folds their arms, and says with the confidence of a man holding a royal flush, "But the laws made it better. They protected the servants." It's said with such conviction that, for a split second, you almost want to applaud the sincerity. But sincerity and accuracy have never been twins, and in this case they aren't even distant cousins. The protection argument is built on the assumption that limiting cruelty transforms ownership into benevolence, as if editing the rules of captivity magically dissolves captivity itself. If someone today invented a facility where they promised to treat their captives with kindness, no one would call it moral progress. They'd call it a crime with nice curtains. But when ancient texts describe similar arrangements, suddenly the curtains become a theological achievement. Some defenders go even further, insisting that the laws were kinder than the surrounding cultures. This is the moral equivalent of saying your landlord deserves a medal because he only raises rent by 20% instead of 40%. Less harmful than the neighbors is not a compelling ethical triumph. It's a tired justification used by people who've run out of real arguments. Even more puzzling is the claim that the institution wasn't eliminated because society wasn't ready. This explanation quietly sidesteps the entire premise of a divine message. When a moral guideline comes from ordinary humans, sure, cultural limitations apply. But when the source is described as eternal, perfect, and unbound by human limitations, saying people weren't ready feels like saying the rain refused to fall because the flowers weren't emotionally prepared. The logic limps so dramatically it should qualify for disability benefits. There's a deeper problem buried underneath this reasoning, the belief that morality trickles down rather than rises up, that humans are waiting generation after generation for the heavens to deliver the next patch update. Yet almost every moral advance, from abolishing torture to recognizing human rights, emerged not from revelation but from uncomfortable conversations, intellectual friction, philosophical courage, and the quiet rebellion of ordinary people who refuse to accept the status quo. Progress has always been a human project, not a heavenly one, and that's precisely why the slavery excuse bothers people more than they sometimes admit. It isn't just the moral contradiction, it's the eerie silence it implies. If ancient societies truly weren't ready, then the divine simply watched centuries of ownership, suffering, and degradation pass by without attempting to challenge it in the slightest. An all-powerful creator who micromanaged clothing fabrics and dietary rules, but couldn't bother to say, "You are not property," ends up sounding less like a moral authority and more like a cosmic bureaucrat with misaligned priorities. It also creates a strange imbalance in moral expectations. The believer is expected to defend the divine, reinterpret ancient laws, perform linguistic gymnastics, and construct elaborate frameworks to sanitize uncomfortable passages. Meanwhile, the divine, supposedly the moral perfection they're defending, contributes no clarification, no correction, no amendment. The silence is deafening, and it forces human beings to do all the intellectual heavy lifting while pretending the burden belongs to someone else. Psychologically, this reveals something striking. Many people are far more moral than their gods. Their instincts rebel against cruelty, yet their loyalty to tradition chains those instincts. So they revise, reinterpret, sanitize, excuse, anything to avoid admitting that the older moral codes were shaped by the fears, limitations, and power structures of their time. People insist ancient texts are timeless because the alternative is admitting the texts are human. And once you allow them to be human, they lose their immunity to criticism. The slavery defense also exposes an emotional dependency hiding beneath the theological armor. Many believers fear that if even one divine law is morally flawed, the entire spiritual structure collapses. It's an all-or-nothing system, perfection or nothing. That kind of architecture breeds fragility, not faith. If your worldview can't survive a single question, it's not a worldview. It's an emotional splint holding together old fractures. And so the slavery excuse becomes a psychological necessity rather than a historical argument. People defend it because they're afraid of the dominoes. They fear what else might fall if they let this one piece wobble. The mind becomes a curator of selective truths, pruned and polished to preserve an image that no longer matches reality. The irony is that reality doesn't demand perfection from anyone. Humans don't crumble when they admit their ancestors were flawed. Cultures grow by confronting their mistakes, not disguising them. But beliefs handed down as unquestionable leave no room for that kind of growth. They demand loyalty, not curiosity. And loyalty, when applied to old ideas, can calcify into something dangerously close to moral stagnation. The slavery excuse, then, isn't merely a flawed argument. It's a case study in cognitive dissonance, a prime example of how far people will stretch language and logic when they feel their identity is on trial. Some twist definitions until they break. Others defend ownership as a form of care. Still others claim humanity simply wasn't mature enough, as if compassion requires a historical learning curve instead of basic empathy. And the strangest part? The people who offer these defenses today would never accept them in any modern context. If a politician passed a law regulating slavery instead of abolishing it, they wouldn't praise the nuance. They would riot. The same person who excuses ancient ownership with a serene smile would explode with righteous anger. If someone suggested their own family could be property, moral clarity returns the moment the scenario becomes personal. But that's the quiet truth beneath all the noise. The personal always clarifies the moral. The moment someone imagines themselves or their loved ones on the receiving end of these divine regulations, the theological haze dissolves, and what remains is something brutally simple, an instinctive recognition that ownership is wrong, no matter how ancient the justification, no matter how sacred the text, no matter how carefully the apologists arrange their defenses. That instinct is older than religion and far more reliable. It doesn't need commandments or translations. It only needs the simple understanding that dignity does not flourish where ownership exists, and no amount of reinterpretation can transform chains into compassion. The most revealing aspect of the slavery debate shows up when someone finally reaches the last refuge of the argument. But the divine message was about spiritual freedom, not physical conditions. It's a poetic line, almost musical, the kind of thing that sounds profound enough to distract from what it's actually saying, which is essentially that the body doesn't matter as long as the soul is flattered. It's an elegant way of putting a silk ribbon on a shackle and calling it transcendence. This idea grows out of an old habit, prioritizing invisible promises over tangible realities. If the body suffers but the spirit is declared victorious, the suffering becomes easier to ignore. It's the same mechanism that allowed oppressive systems to survive for centuries while still calling themselves righteous. Pain becomes character building, oppression becomes discipline, and ownership becomes order. Once you frame suffering as part of a divine plan, the human cost becomes invisible, at least to those not paying it. But the strangest thing about this spiritual-physical split is that it unintentionally exposes the biggest flaw in the slavery excuse. If spiritual freedom matters more than physical freedom, nothing stops the divine from declaring both. Nothing prevents a clearer message, one that elevates human dignity without compromising anyone's faith. If spiritual liberation can transcend cultural limitations, why can't moral clarity? Why can the divine articulate the structure of the cosmos but not the basic truth that no human being belongs to another? Here's where the story gets more human and more honest. The ancient world was built on hierarchy, power, and ownership. That's not a moral indictment. It's a historical observation. People interpreted the world through the lens they had, and that lens was often shaped by fear, scarcity, warfare, and tradition. They didn't transcend their environment. They encoded it into their laws and their stories. Those who came later, seeing the harm, pushed society forward. The moral arc was drawn by human hands, not divine ones. Yet even today, some believers inherit these old ideas with a sense of duty. They feel responsible not only for the moral vision of their tradition, but for its mistakes too, as if acknowledging a flaw is equivalent to betrayal. They forget that the deepest loyalty to an idea sometimes requires confronting its failures instead of defending them. Growth demands honesty, not self-punishment, not shame, just clarity. The tragedy is that clarity often arrives quietly, disguised as discomfort. It begins with a small question. Why would a perfect being allow this? That question sits like a pebble in the shoe of the mind. It irritates, it shifts weight, it forces adjustments. Some people stop walking, others remove the pebble, and some pretend they don't notice the pain at all, hoping the silence will make it go away. The slavery excuse, at its core, is an attempt to silence that pebble. It's the intellectual version of wrapping a bandage around a cracked foundation. You hide the fracture beneath layers of explanation, reinterpretation, softened translations, and sentimental language. But the fracture remains, and deep down, most people feel it. They might not say it aloud, but they sense the tension between their moral intuition and the text they were told to trust unquestioningly. Moral intuition is older than scripture and stronger than dogma. It belongs not to any tradition but to the human condition itself. Even children understand fairness long before they understand philosophy. A child knows that taking someone's freedom is wrong. A child knows that hurting someone because rules say it's allowed doesn't make it right. Morality begins there, in the unpolished, untheologized instinct to treat others as beings with their own inner worlds. When modern believers defend ancient slavery, they're not following their intuition. They're silencing it. They're not expressing moral clarity. They're suppressing it. And suppression breeds confusion, not faith. It creates a split between what they feel to be right and what they feel obligated to defend. That split drains authenticity from their worldview and replaces it with ritualized rationalization. It's not devotion, it's emotional debt. And here lies the quiet absurdity. The people offering these excuses are often far more compassionate than the texts they're trying to sanitize. Their own hearts rebel against the notion of ownership. Their own instinct rejects cruelty, and their own empathy pushes against the limits of tradition. They bend interpretation because they can't bear the thought that the cosmos might endorse something they find reprehensible. They become more humane than their own gods, without ever admitting it. The slavery defense, then, doesn't reveal the moral brilliance of ancient law. It reveals the moral depth of modern humans. It shows how far people are willing to stretch, reinterpret, and soften ancient ideas to match the ethical standards they already hold. The irony is that this very effort proves what they're trying so hard not to see. Morality didn't descend from heaven, it ascended from humanity. Once you recognize that, the slavery excuse dissolves, not through argument but through observation. You don't need philosophy degrees or historical analysis to see the problem. You only need the basic understanding that dignity cannot coexist with ownership. No divine instruction can turn a human being into property without destroying the concept of humanity itself. Some people fear that admitting this will unravel everything, yet the opposite is true. When you see ancient texts as human expressions, flawed, beautiful, limited, you free yourself from the impossible task of defending their every detail. You allow yourself to grow past them, not in rebellion but in evolution. You don't lose meaning, you gain honesty, and honesty is a far stronger foundation than any excuse. Slavery doesn't become moral because it's old, it doesn't become acceptable because it's regulated, and it certainly doesn't become righteous because someone found a way to translate it into softer language. Ownership is ownership, chains are chains. The human spirit doesn't care whether they're made of iron or metaphor, it cares only whether they exist. And once you understand that, the entire excuse collapses under its own weight, not because the argument is weak, though it is, but because the human heart is stronger than any justification. People know what dignity looks like, they know what compassion feels like, and they know intuitively that any worldview requiring them to defend ownership is asking them to betray their own humanity. There's another layer to this whole conversation that often goes unnoticed, mostly because it's uncomfortable in a way that isn't dramatic, just quietly revealing. It's the question of why people feel compelled to defend historical cruelty with such determination in the first place. Not many would argue in favor of feudalism, or child labor, or public executions. Yet slavery, when wrapped in sacred language, becomes an exception. The instinct to protect it isn't born from admiration for the practice, it's born from anxiety about the structure surrounding it. If someone admits that one piece of the sacred story is ethically flawed, the worry is that the rest will unravel, like pulling a loose thread on a sweater. But the unraveling doesn't happen because the thread was pulled. It happens because the sweater was stitched with the wrong expectations. People were told these texts were flawless blueprints instead of cultural artifacts. They were told perfection lived inside them, so any imperfection feels like an earthquake. But the earthquake isn't real. It only feels catastrophic because the structure was placed on a pedestal too fragile to carry its own weight. There's no ruin waiting on the other side of honesty, just a more grounded understanding of where these ideas came from and why they reflect the worldviews of the people who wrote them. This is why the slavery excuse keeps renewing itself like a software patch. No matter how many times it's debunked, explained, or discussed, somewhere someone reboots it, rephrases it, polishes it, and presents it as if the debate just began. It's less a moral position and more a ritual, a ceremonial reaffirmation of loyalty to a belief system. But rituals lose their power when you see the mechanics behind them. They become motions rather than meaning. And the mechanics here are straightforward. People fear moral solitude. They fear being left in a world where they have to navigate ethics without a universal command manual. But that fear underestimates the human mind. People have been creating ethical frameworks long before writing, long before temples, long before hierarchies of belief. Morality didn't appear because someone declared it. It appeared because humans had to coexist without devouring each other. Survival required empathy long before it required worship. The slavery excuse also reveals something fascinating about how people relate to authority. When an idea is attributed to a cosmic power, it becomes insulated from critique, not because it's better, but because questioning it feels like trespassing on divine property. People tiptoe around the text as if the ink itself might take offense. It's a habit inherited from centuries of of conditioning, not always malicious, but deeply ingrained. But authority that cannot be questioned is not guidance, it's dependency. And dependency creates moral paralysis. It trains people to outsource their judgment, even when their instincts scream that something is wrong. Once you internalize the belief that righteousness stems from obedience, questioning becomes a threat instead of a tool. The slavery defense is a direct consequence of that mindset. People defend the text not because it's defensible, but because they believe loyalty requires it. Yet the moment someone steps outside that framework, even briefly, the entire picture shifts. They begin to notice how morality evolves not through obedience, but through curiosity, reflection, and the willingness to challenge inherited assumptions. Every meaningful ethical shift in history, every movement that expanded human dignity, started with someone refusing to accept the moral ceiling handed to them. Not rebels in the dramatic sense, but renegades in the quiet, thoughtful way that actually changes societies. Once seen through this lens, the slavery excuse becomes almost archaic, a relic from a time when people mistook authority for truth. It doesn't hold up because it was never meant to. It exists as a protective spell, a way of preserving a fragile idea of perfection by sacrificing honesty. And the moment someone chooses honesty, even cautiously, the old spell breaks. The argument loses its force. The contradictions loosen their grip. The walls that once felt towering and sacred become ordinary, even familiar, like old stones you've passed on a path countless times without noticing their shape. What replaces the excuse isn't cynicism or emptiness. It's something far more stable, a confidence in your own ability to navigate the world without needing the past to be flawless. You stop defending what doesn't deserve defense. You stop carrying the weight of ancient contradictions on your shoulders. You stop bending your compassion to fit the boundaries of old texts. You simply become more human and, ironically, more free than any spiritual liberation argument has ever promised. There's a peculiar irony in the way people engage with uncomfortable parts of their traditions. When a moral failure appears in any other historical document, they analyze it, they contextualize it, they critique it. But when the same failure appears in a sacred text, the instinct flips. Suddenly, the goal is not to understand, but to shield. Interpretation becomes less a tool of clarity and more a form of defense architecture, an intricate system of emotional walls designed to protect a fragile certainty. That fragility doesn't come from the text itself. It comes from the idea that perfection was ever a reasonable expectation. When you expect flawless moral insight from people living in eras shaped by survival, conquest, scarcity, and tribalism, you're not honoring the past, you're distorting it. You're forcing ancient voices into roles they never claimed, expecting from them an ethical vision that only emerged through centuries of collective human struggle. This is what makes the slavery excuse feel so oddly out of place in modern discussions. It attempts to retrofit morality onto a world that didn't possess our current understanding of human dignity. People back then weren't debating universal rights or questioning hierarchical ownership. They were simply trying to survive in systems that normalized control, power, and labor extraction. None of that makes them evil, it just makes them human. But insisting that their ideas were delivered from beyond humanity creates a conflict that can't be resolved without bending either the text or the mind defending it. What's fascinating is how often defenders unknowingly reveal this tension. They start by insisting that the ancient laws were perfect. Then, when pressed, they shift to saying they were the best possible for the time. A moment later, they argue that people weren't ready. And eventually, if you follow the conversation long enough, they land on the idea that the rules were mainly symbolic or spiritual anyway. 4 different arguments, 4 different tones, 4 incompatible explanations circling one discomfort, the acknowledgement that the system reflected human limitations, not divine instructions. But that discomfort doesn't need to be terrifying. If anything, it should be liberating. Once you stop expecting ancient words to carry eternal authority, you free the past from impossible standards. You allow it to be what it truly was, a collection of attempts, sometimes wise, sometimes misguided, to create order in a chaotic world. You don't need to defend the flaws. You only need to recognize them. And here's where an unexpected calm enters the picture. When you stop forcing perfection onto the past, something beautiful happens. You gain permission to evolve beyond it. You can admire ancient insights without being trapped by them. You can critique harmful ideas without feeling guilty. You can see the people who wrote these texts not as prophets of unchanging truth, but as thinkers navigating the same ethical fog that we navigate today, though with far fewer tools. The psychological shift is subtle but profound. You replace fear with curiosity. You replace obligation with inquiry. You replace defensive interpretation with open exploration. The conversation stops being a battlefield and becomes a dialogue, one where the past and present meet as equals rather than master and servant. This shift also changes how you see yourself. Instead of being a protector of inherited ideas, you become a participant in the ongoing creation of moral understanding. You're not merely guarding an ancient flame, you're adding your own light to it. You're shaping the future rather than preserving the past. The weight of perfection lifts, and with it, the compulsion to justify what cannot be justified. And perhaps the most surprising part is this. Once you stop defending the slavery excuse, you don't lose reverence for meaning. You gain a deeper, more grounded respect for the human minds that built the foundations of our moral thought. You see their courage, their limitations, their blind spots, their brilliance, and you realize that the greatest tribute to their work is not defending their errors, but continuing the journey they started. Slavery was one chapter in humanity's long, tangled story of learning how to treat each other with dignity. It wasn't the final word, and it never needed to be. The real tragedy isn't that ancient people accepted it. It's that modern people feel compelled to justify it. Once that compulsion fades, the conversation becomes clearer. The path forward becomes wider, and the past stops being a cage and becomes a classroom instead. That realization is the final answer. Not the loudest answer, not the most dramatic, but the one that can't be argued away. When you stop telling yourself stories to protect old ideas, the truth stands quietly in front of you. Morality grows when we're honest, not when we explain away harm. And that honesty leads to a simple understanding, one that needs no divine endorsement. No human being is property, and no excuse can make it otherwise. So before we end this conversation, I want to ask you something, not as a call to action, but as an invitation into the dialogue. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what's your take on all this?